As someone who does a lot of research in supply chain management, a number of people have asked me, why are we having shortages in the US since COVID-19 started? Is it a problem with the way we do supply chain? Is the fault just in time? Is the fault globalization? So I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about COVID-19 and also what we can do as companies going forward. So let's first sort of put this in context. In supply chain, the goal is all about efficiency. How can I take costs out of the system so that I can get the maximum amount of product, from the raw material supplier all the way to the end customer, the consumer, if you will, in the most efficient way possible. And so supply chain managers are focused on efficiency. And we are capable of making decisions when disruptions happen that still maintain that efficiency. So the goal is about managing the system. However, occasionally we have something that we call black swan events. Typical disruptions are examples like telecommunication failures or a transportation failure or a weather related issue. But black swan events are those events that are completely unpredictable that have a huge impact on the supply chain. And I've got some examples up here on the slide. We've got 2001, 9/11, you had the terrorist attack, which basically reduced demand when that happened. You had the SARS effect, 2002, 2003 in China, where it was contained, but you basically affected supply. There were companies that were manufacturing product. 2008, you had the Great Recession. Again, you had a real reduction in demand. 2011, you had the earthquake and tsunami, which affected both the IT supply chain and the automotive supply chain. So companies paradoxically moved out of Japan to get into a safer location. And then you have the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. And here's the difference. COVID-19 affects not just supply, but in demand. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So COVID-19 clearly impacts supply and demand in a number of ways. First of all, sources of supply worldwide have become constrained. That is because companies are not manufacturing, their workers are sick, and therefore they're not able to produce the product. Now, China is a source of product. It's a supplier, but it also buys product. So it's a large consumer market. Now, in 2002, 2003, when we had the original SARS epidemic or pandemic, China was about 4% of world GDP. In 2019, China was about 19.7% of world GDP. Therefore, that is a significant drag on the world economic stage when 20% of supply is necessarily curtailed. So when you have that employees are not able to work in a manufacturing center and manufacture products, they're not getting paid. And if they're not getting paid, they're not buying product. So notice that you're also not only just restraining supply, you're also reducing demand. Now, if you look at it in the US context, this is important to consider, that consumers drives about 70% of US GDP. How the consumers actually purchase products affects US GDP. In the same sense, another factor to consider is that 77% of the US GDP is made up of services. And services are different than product. You cannot inventory a service. And for a service to actually take place, you need customer interaction. If the person is not sitting in the barber chair or not sitting in the restaurant or not sitting in the plane, they are not able to partake of the service. You cannot provide the service. So when you have COVID-19 that restricts both demand and supply, it has a huge impact. In the US, we have really good supply chains. We have reliable transportation. We have excellent infrastructure. And we've taken a lot of costs out of the system. So why is it with COVID-19 we run out of commodity products like toilet paper? The slide, as you can see on the left-hand side, you've got bare shelves. On the right-hand side, though, you have product. So clearly it is not just all products. It's only certain products that are that you're running out of. And the question is, why? What are the reasons that this is happening? And one of the things we need to talk about is this idea that in supply chain we call the bullwhip effect. And that is when there is a little bit of change in demand at, let's say, at the consumer level, then this change gets amplified as you go upstream in the supply chain. So let's say there's an increase in demand of about 10%. The retailer gets excited and goes, you know what, I better order an extra 10%. So then the wholesaler who sells to the retailer says, oh my goodness, there's an extra 10%. They will add on an extra 10%. That goes to the manufacturer. The manufacturer sees that increase in demand. They'll add another 10%. So by the time the raw material supplier sees it, you've got a 40% increase in demand. And what this is we call it the bullwhip, because you imagine a little movement at the handle will cause a huge increase or decrease by the time you get to the end of the whip, and that's why we call it the bullwhip effect. Now, how do you solve the bullwhip effect? Well, some of the reasons you have the bullwhip effect is because you have misinformation, you have long lead times from when that product is ordered to when it actually arrives, you have batching, you have overreacting, you have hoarding. So the way to counteract the bullwhip effect is to share information in the supply chain, reduce the batch size or the order size, reduce the lead time, share information so you understand, and so that people won't feel they need to hoard, which then goes back to, let's look at our supply chain in a regular grocery store. So why is it that we run out of toilet paper? Well, you've got people that are overreacting. They're buying 1 year's supply of toilet paper, and no supply chain could actually predict that kind of demand and actually be prepared, as we talked about the fact that that's beyond a regular disruption. So then you have people blaming just in time. Is it because we've sort of taken inventory out of the system? Or they'll even blame globalization. But like I said, no one's going to keep a whole year's worth of extra toilet paper. Because remember, toilet paper is really bulky. It's going to take up a lot of space. It's a low margin item. No one's going to keep that available when that demand happens. And it takes a while for the manufacturers of toilet paper to go from producing toilet paper for companies versus consumers. So they're different types, and that's going to cause a change. So the other argument sometimes says is, well, the fault of this is because we've emphasized globalization. We are sourcing products worldwide. But let's be clear, globalization actually has been shown to be beneficial. In 1990, the poverty level was $1.90 a day, and that was about 36% of the world's population. Well, in 2019, it dropped to less than 10%, raising 1.1 billion out of poverty. Same thing happened with life expectancy. In 1990, 64.2 years, 2019, 72.6 years. So clearly, globalization is a value and is not necessarily the fault here. So let's look at what can companies do going forward. Number one, you need to build confidence in the system so that it'll encourage more rational behavior. You're not going to have this hoarding or overreaction. You need to break down functional silos within the firm so that accounting is talking to finance, is talking to marketing, is talking to operations, is talking to supply chain, and realizing that everyone needs to work together. You need to increase transparency and information sharing within the firm so that employees are talking to managers. So there is that kind of exchange. There's also needs to be information sharing along the supply chain as well. Talk to your suppliers, talk to your supplier's supplier, talk to your customers. You got to increase or enhance end-to-end visibility. That means you got to talk to as many levels in the supply chain as you can so you can understand what their inventory issues are, what their supply problems are. You got to look for alternative sources of supply. Don't just put all your suppliers in one part of the world. Perhaps maybe you can use that for stable demand and think about building manufacturing capabilities closer to the US so you can handle that variability in demand. Look for ways you can reconfigure the supply chain to reduce the impact of any kinds of supply chain disruptions. And finally, develop collaborative relationships so that all of you in the supply chain can think of ways that you need to work together to be able to prosper in this uncertain times ahead. Thank you.